Paris Jackson's emotional moment at Michael Jackson's memorial service. On July 7, 2009, millions of people around the world stopped what they were doing to watch a family say goodbye to one of the most recognizable entertainers in history. Michael Jackson's memorial service at Staples Center in Los Angeles was not simply a tribute to a global superstar. It was also an intensely personal moment for the people who knew him as a father, brother, son, and friend. Among those standing closest to the center of that grief were Michael Jackson's 3 children, Prince Michael Jackson, I. Paris Jackson, and Prince Michael Jackson II, better known publicly as Blanket. For years, the world had seen Michael Jackson as the king of pop. His music had crossed generations and continents. His performances had become part of popular culture. His face, voice, dance moves, and music videos were recognized almost everywhere. But on that day, the audience was reminded that behind the superstar was a father whose children had lost someone they loved. And then came a moment that few people watching expected. Michael's 11-year-old daughter, Paris, stepped toward the microphone. She was surrounded by thousands of people inside the arena, and millions more watching from home. Cameras were pointed toward her. The world was listening. For a child, speaking publicly at a parent's memorial would have been an extraordinary emotional challenge under any circumstances. For Paris, the circumstances were almost unimaginable. She was not simply saying goodbye to her father in private. She was doing it in front of the world. And when she began speaking, something changed. The massive memorial service suddenly felt deeply intimate. Paris was no longer simply Michael Jackson's daughter standing beside a famous family. She was an 11-year-old girl grieving the loss of her dad. Her words were brief, but their emotional impact was enormous. She described Michael as the best father she could imagine. Then, overcome with emotion, she struggled to continue. The moment became one of the most remembered scenes from the entire memorial. It is easy, years later, to watch that footage and focus on the celebrity, the cameras, or the enormous audience. But to understand what that moment may have meant for Paris, it helps to look beyond the spectacle. This was a child saying goodbye to her father. The world before the memorial. Michael Jackson's death on June 25, 2009, shocked the world. News of his passing spread rapidly, triggering an extraordinary global reaction. Fans gathered outside his home and around the world. His music returned to charts. Television networks devoted enormous amounts of coverage to his life and career. For Michael's children, however, the situation was fundamentally different. They had not lost an icon. They had lost their father. The distinction is important. Millions of people had memories of Michael Jackson. They remembered concerts, albums, music videos, performances, interviews, and public appearances. His children had memories that were much more personal. They knew him at home. They knew him as the person who could comfort them, make them laugh, protect them, and spend time with them away from the enormous public spotlight surrounding his career. That private relationship became part of the emotional context of the memorial. The service itself was filled with famous performers, musicians, friends, family members, and public figures. Songs were performed, speeches were delivered, stories were shared. People celebrated Michael's extraordinary career while mourning his sudden death. Yet as the service continued, the focus repeatedly returned to the people closest to him. And eventually, attention turned toward his children. Paris Jackson was only 11. One of the most important details about the moment is also one of the easiest to overlook. Paris was 11 years old. 11. At that age, most children are still navigating school, friendships, family life, and the ordinary challenges of growing up. Paris was dealing with something far more serious. She had lost her father, and she was being asked or had chosen to speak about him before a massive audience. There is no way to know exactly what she was feeling inside that moment. Only Paris herself could fully describe that experience. But what viewers could see was a child struggling with genuine grief. Her voice became emotional. She cried. The people around her appeared deeply affected, and the atmosphere inside the arena changed immediately. For much of the memorial, audiences had watched famous adults talk about Michael Jackson. But when Paris stepped forward, the perspective became completely different. The superstar disappeared for a moment. What remained was a daughter. The weight of the spotlight. Imagine being 11 years old and knowing that millions of people are watching you. Imagine trying to speak while grieving. Imagine knowing that every facial expression, every pause, every tear could be captured by cameras and replayed around the world. That was the extraordinary situation Paris faced. Of course, nobody outside her can know precisely how much pressure she felt. It would be unfair to pretend that we can read her thoughts. But the circumstances themselves were overwhelming. Michael Jackson's life had always attracted intense public attention. His death was no different. Everything connected to his funeral and memorial became a subject of worldwide interest. His children, who had largely been protected from intense public exposure during their childhood, suddenly became central figures in the story. Paris's decision to speak therefore carried enormous emotional significance. She was not delivering a carefully prepared celebrity speech designed to promote something. She was speaking about her father, and the simplicity of her words made the moment even more powerful. Daddy. Perhaps one of the most moving aspects of Paris's appearance was the way she referred to Michael. She did not speak about the king of pop. She spoke about Daddy. That distinction says so much. To the world, Michael Jackson was a legendary performer. To Paris, he was her father. That was the person she was mourning. His fame did not make her grief smaller. If anything, it meant that her private pain was being experienced under an enormous public spotlight. The world wanted to understand Michael Jackson's final years, his career, his controversies, and his legacy. But Paris brought the conversation back to something much simpler. A daughter loved her dad. The words that stayed with people. Paris spoke about how much she loved her father, and how important he was to her. One of the most remembered sentiments from her speech was her description of Michael as the best father she could imagine. It was a remarkably simple statement. There were no complicated explanations, no attempt to summarize Michael Jackson's entire career, no effort to define his place in music history. Instead, Paris offered something deeply personal. She talked about the father she knew. That perspective affected many viewers because it reminded them that public figures have private identities. Michael Jackson had spent decades being discussed as an entertainer. His children knew another side of him. For Paris, his greatest significance was not necessarily the number of records he sold or the number of awards he received. He was her dad. And that was enough. When the emotion took over, as Paris continued speaking, the emotion became difficult for her to contain. She cried. Her voice broke. The people around her watched with concern and affection. And then came the moment that would be replayed countless times. Paris expressed how much she loved her father, and became visibly overwhelmed. Her grief was not polished. It was not perfectly controlled. It was not presented like a professional performance. And that is precisely why the moment affected so many people. It was real. There is something profoundly human about watching someone struggle to speak, because the person they are talking about means so much to them. Paris did not need a long speech. She did not need dramatic language. Her tears communicated what words could not. A different image of Michael Jackson, the memorial also changed the way some viewers thought about Michael Jackson. For years, the public conversation around him had been dominated by his career, his appearance, his performances, and controversies surrounding his life. But Paris offered another perspective. She presented him through the eyes of a child who loved him. That does not erase the complexity of Michael Jackson's life or the many public debates surrounding him. Instead, it provides another part of the story. A person can be a global celebrity and still occupy a completely ordinary role within a family. Michael Jackson could be the king of pop to millions of people, but inside his home, he could simply be dad. Paris's words brought that distinction into sharp focus. The audience's reaction. The response to Paris's appearance was immediate. People around the world reacted emotionally to what they had witnessed. Many viewers were struck by her courage. Others focused on how young she was and how difficult the situation must have been. For fans of Michael Jackson, the moment became especially meaningful because they were seeing a side of the family that had rarely been exposed so publicly. Paris was not trying to become the center of attention. The circumstances placed her there. Her grief naturally drew the attention of the audience. And because her words were so personal, many people felt as though they were witnessing something deeply private. That created a complicated situation. On one hand, the world wanted to comfort a grieving child. On the other, the enormous global audience meant that her most vulnerable moment became public history. That tension would remain part of Paris Jackson's life long after the memorial ended. A child suddenly in the public eye. Before Michael's death, Paris had largely lived a protected life. Michael was known for keeping his children away from much of the public attention surrounding him. There were moments when fans saw them, but their everyday lives were largely shielded. After his death, however, that changed. The memorial service became one of the first moments when the wider world saw Paris not simply as Michael Jackson's child, but as an individual experiencing grief. That visibility came with consequences. People began discussing her personality, appearance, family relationships, interests, and future. The world had suddenly become interested in the girl who had spoken at her father's memorial. But it is important to remember that she was still a child. The public image that began forming around her was connected to an intensely private experience. The meaning of courage. When people describe Paris's speech as courageous, it is important to understand what that word means. Courage does not necessarily mean that someone is not afraid. It can mean continuing despite fear, sadness, or uncertainty. Paris did not appear completely composed. She became emotional. She cried, but she still stood there. She still spoke, and she honored the person she had lost. That is one reason the moment continues to resonate. Her strength was not in pretending she was unaffected. Her strength was in allowing herself to express how much her father meant to her. The difference between a celebrity and a father. One of the strongest themes surrounding the speech is the difference between public identity and private identity. Michael Jackson's public identity was enormous. He was a global superstar. He was an artist whose influence extended across music, dance, fashion, and entertainment. But Paris did not need to explain any of that. Her relationship with him existed outside those achievements. She knew the person behind the stage. She knew the father. That is why her words felt so different from the tributes delivered by celebrities and professional colleagues. Other speakers could discuss Michael's artistic genius. They could describe his performances. They could talk about his influence. Paris could tell the audience something much more personal. She could tell them what it meant to be his daughter. The moment became part of history. The memorial service itself became one of the most significant public events surrounding Michael Jackson's death. But within that enormous event, Paris's brief speech became one of the defining moments. It was not because she delivered a lengthy argument. It was not because she gave an elaborate performance. It was because of the emotion. Her appearance captured the human side of the tragedy. People watching were reminded that Michael Jackson's death was not simply the loss of a celebrity. It was the loss of a father. For his children, the consequences were personal and lifelong. Growing up after the memorial. After the memorial, Paris continued growing up under extraordinary circumstances. Her childhood had been affected by the loss of her father, and by the attention that followed it. As she became older, she increasingly developed her own identity. She explored music, acting, modeling, fashion, and other creative pursuits. The public continued to associate her with Michael Jackson, but Paris gradually became more than simply his daughter in the eyes of many people. She became an artist in her own right. Yet the connection to her father remained central to her story. It is difficult to separate Paris Jackson from Michael Jackson, because their relationship is part of her personal history. But that does not mean she is defined entirely by him. In many ways, the memorial speech can be viewed as the beginning of a much larger public journey. The world first saw her as a grieving daughter. Over time, it began seeing her as an individual. The burden of a famous legacy. Being the child of a global icon can come with unique challenges. Every accomplishment can be compared to the parent. Every mistake can receive extra attention. Every public appearance can invite speculation. For Paris, that reality began early. Her father's legacy was enormous. There was no simple way to step outside it, but she has repeatedly had to find her own identity while carrying the Jackson name. That process is complicated for anyone. For someone whose childhood included such an intensely public memorial, it is even more unusual. The little girl who stood beside her family in 2009 eventually became an adult with her own career, opinions, relationships, artistic ambitions, and public identity. Why people still remember the speech? There are many reasons people continue to remember Paris's words. First, the moment was unexpected. Second, she was extremely young. Third, her emotions were unmistakably genuine. And fourth, the speech gave viewers a perspective they could understand regardless of how familiar they were with Michael Jackson. You did not have to be a lifelong Michael Jackson fan to understand what Paris was saying. Most people understand the bond between a parent and child. Most people understand what it means to lose someone you love. And most people can recognize the pain of trying to talk about someone when the emotions are too strong. That universal quality helped make the moment unforgettable. Beyond the headlines. When celebrity stories become major news events, it can be tempting to focus on headlines. Who attended? What did they wear? What songs were performed? What did people say afterward? But Paris's moment reminds us that behind those headlines are real human beings. Her grief was not entertainment. Her tears were not a performance. She was a child saying goodbye. That distinction matters. Looking back at the memorial years later, it is easy to forget just how young Paris was. She was only 11. The world saw a brave young girl, but bravery should not make us forget her vulnerability. She was still a child who had lost her father, a father through his daughter's eyes. Perhaps the most powerful thing Paris offered was not a detailed description of Michael Jackson. Instead, she gave the audience a glimpse of what he meant to her. That is a completely different kind of testimony. A music critic can discuss Michael's influence. A historian can discuss his career. A fellow performer can discuss his talent. But a child can speak about what it feels like to be loved by a parent. Paris's words belong to that last category. Her speech was about a relationship. It was about love. It was about loss. And it was about saying goodbye. The silence after her words. Sometimes the most powerful moments are not the longest ones. Paris did not need to fill the arena with a long speech. Her emotion created a silence of its own. For a moment, the massive crowd and worldwide audience were not thinking about Michael Jackson's records or his fame. They were watching his daughter mourn. That is why the moment felt so intimate, despite the enormous scale of the event. A stadium filled with thousands of people suddenly felt like a family gathering. The world was watching, but the emotion belonged to Paris. The legacy of that day. Michael Jackson's legacy has continued to evolve since his death. His music remains influential. His performances continue to be watched. New generations discover his songs. Debates about his life continue. But the memorial remains an important part of the public story, because it showed how many different relationships people had with him. For fans, he was an icon. For musicians, he was an extraordinary influence. For friends, he was someone they knew personally. And for his children, he was Dad. Paris's speech made that final perspective impossible to ignore. Paris and her own voice. As Paris grew older, she increasingly found ways to express herself beyond her father's legacy. She became involved in music and other creative work. She developed a public identity of her own. Her career has not erased her connection to Michael Jackson. Instead, it has created a more complicated picture of what it means to be his daughter. She can honor him while still becoming her own person. She can remember her childhood while creating a future. And she can carry his influence without being completely defined by it. That process is one that many children of famous parents understand. But Paris experienced it under an extraordinary level of public attention. What that 11-year-old girl could not have known. Standing on that stage in 2009, Paris could not have known how important that moment would become. She could not have known that millions of people would remember her tears. She could not have known that the footage would be replayed for years. She could not have known that people would continue discussing her words long after she became an adult. She was simply grieving. She was trying to say goodbye. And she was trying to honor her father. Sometimes history is created through moments that were never intended to become historic. That was one of those moments. A moment of humanity. The memorial service was filled with extraordinary performances and powerful tributes. But Paris's speech stood out for a different reason. It was human. There was no need for spectacle. No need for choreography. No need for a stage production. Just a daughter standing in front of the world and talking about her father. That simplicity gave the moment its strength. It reminded viewers that even the biggest celebrities leave behind ordinary human relationships. Michael Jackson had millions of fans, but only a small number of people could call him Dad. Paris was one of them. The emotional reality of saying goodbye. Grief does not follow a script. People cry. People become silent. People remember small details. People struggle to find words. People sometimes appear strong, and then suddenly become overwhelmed. Paris's appearance reflected that unpredictability. She tried to speak. She became emotional. And the people around her supported her. That is what makes the memory so powerful. It was not perfect. It did not need to be. It was real. What the speech meant to fans. For Michael Jackson's fans, Paris's words offered a deeply personal connection to the man they admired. Fans had spent years watching Michael perform. They had seen him dance across stages and heard him sing songs that became part of their lives. But his children had seen something different. They had experienced him in a family setting. Paris's words allowed fans a brief glimpse into that private world. They could never fully know what Michael was like as a father simply from a public speech. But they could understand that Paris loved him deeply. And that alone had a profound emotional impact. The child behind the celebrity name. The name Jackson carries enormous cultural weight. For Paris, it was her family name before it was a global brand. That is another reason the memorial moment remains significant. People often forget that children born into famous families do not choose the attention that comes with their names. Paris did not choose to become the daughter of the king of pop. She was simply born into an extraordinary family. After her father's death, the public attention surrounding her became even greater. Yet her speech showed that beneath the famous surname was an ordinary emotional reality. She missed her dad. The importance of remembering her age. Whenever the memorial speech is discussed, Paris's age should remain part of the conversation. She was not an experienced public speaker. She was not a celebrity trained to manage cameras. She was not an adult who had spent years learning how to handle media attention. She was a child. That context makes the moment even more significant. At 11, she had to stand before an audience of extraordinary size during one of the most painful experiences of her life. Nobody should expect a child in that situation to behave perfectly. Paris did not need to. Her emotion was enough. The image that stayed. Among all the photographs and video clips from Michael Jackson's memorial, images of Paris crying have become particularly memorable. They capture something that words cannot fully explain. Her face showed the pain of losing someone she loved. For many viewers, that image became symbolic of the human cost of Michael's death. It was a reminder that behind the millions of fans mourning around the world was a family experiencing a very different kind of loss. Fans would eventually return home. They would listen to Michael's music again. They would talk about his career. But Paris and her siblings had to continue living without their father. That reality would remain long after the memorial ended. From grief to adulthood, time changes how people understand moments from their childhood. Paris has grown from the 11-year-old girl seen at the memorial into an adult, with a life and career of her own. As she has matured, she has spoken publicly at different times about her father, her childhood, and the complicated experience of growing up as Michael Jackson's daughter. Her perspective has naturally changed with age. What she understood at 11 was different from what she could understand as a teenager. And what she understands as an adult is different again. That is one reason the memorial speech should not be treated as the complete story of Paris's relationship with her father. It was one moment, a powerful moment, but still only one moment in a much larger life. A daughter's goodbye. Ultimately, Paris's appearance at the memorial can be understood in the simplest possible terms. It was a daughter saying goodbye to her father. Everything else, the fame, the cameras, the audience, the media coverage, the historic venue, was secondary to that relationship. Michael Jackson may have belonged to the world as an entertainer, but he belonged to Paris as her father. That is why her words carried such emotional weight. She did not need to explain his entire legacy. She only needed to explain what he meant to her. And her message was clear. She loved him. Why the moment still matters. More than a decade later, the memory of Paris speaking at the memorial remains powerful, because it captures an emotion that fame cannot protect anyone from. Michael Jackson had reached a level of celebrity almost impossible to imagine. But his children could not be protected from the pain of losing him. Paris's tears showed that even the most famous family can experience the same fundamental human emotions as everyone else. Love, loss, grief, memory, and the desire to hold on to someone who is no longer there. Those emotions are universal. That is why the moment continues to resonate. The beginning of a new chapter. The memorial service marked the end of Michael Jackson's life, but for his children it also marked the beginning of a completely different chapter. They had to grow up without their father. They had to navigate life while carrying one of the most recognizable family names in entertainment. They had to deal with public curiosity and expectations. And they had to discover who they were. For Paris, that journey has included finding her own creative voice. The girl who once stood on stage crying for her father eventually became a woman capable of speaking for herself. That transformation is important. Her memorial speech should not only be remembered as a moment of sadness. It can also be remembered as one moment in the story of how she grew into her own identity. The lasting image of Paris. When people remember Paris Jackson at the memorial, they often remember the tears first. But there was something else there too. There was love. Her emotion existed because the relationship mattered. The sadness was evidence of the bond. Her words showed that Michael Jackson was not merely a distant superstar in her life. He was someone she loved deeply. That may be the most meaningful part of the entire moment. Looking back today, looking back years later, it is tempting to analyze the speech from every possible angle. What did it mean? How did the audience react? How did it affect Paris's public image? How did it influence the way people viewed Michael Jackson? Those are all interesting questions. But perhaps the simplest interpretation is also the most powerful. An 11-year-old girl lost her father. She stood before the world. She tried to tell everyone how much he meant to her. And she became overwhelmed with emotion. That is enough. A memory that belongs to Paris. Although millions of people witnessed the speech, the memory ultimately belongs to Paris and her family. The public can remember what happened. Fans can discuss the emotional impact. People can watch the footage. But only Paris knows what that moment truly felt like. Only she knows what memories of her father were going through her mind. Only she knows how difficult it was to stand there. That is why it is important to approach the moment with compassion. Rather than treating her grief as a spectacle, it can be understood as a deeply personal experience that happened to unfold before the world. Michael Jackson's daughter, but also Paris. Perhaps the most important lesson from the memorial is that Paris should not be remembered only as Michael Jackson's daughter. She is also Paris. She has her own voice, her own ambitions, her own experiences, her own challenges, her own story. The memorial was one of the first moments when the world saw her clearly, but it was not the final definition of who she would become. Instead, it was a snapshot of a child experiencing one of the most painful days of her young life. The adult Paris would eventually have to build a life beyond that moment. And she did. The power of a few words. Sometimes people assume that memorable speeches require extraordinary language. Paris proved otherwise. She did not need a long explanation. She did not need a carefully constructed argument. Her message was simple. She loved her father. She missed him. She believed he had been an extraordinary dad. Those few ideas were enough to move an audience around the world. Perhaps that is because grief strips away unnecessary language. When someone is gone, the most important things can become surprisingly simple. I love you. I miss you. Thank you. Goodbye. A moment the world could not ignore. Michael Jackson's memorial was designed to celebrate a legendary career, but Paris's appearance made the event deeply personal. Suddenly, the audience was not simply mourning an entertainer. They were witnessing a family mourn a father. That shift in perspective was powerful. It reminded everyone watching that Michael Jackson's story was not only about music. It was also about the people who loved him privately. His children were among the most important people in that story, and Paris, even at only 11 years old, gave the world a glimpse of that relationship. What we can learn from her courage. Paris's memorial speech offers a lesson about grief and courage. We sometimes imagine strength as being calm, controlled, and unaffected. But grief does not work that way. Sometimes strength means admitting that you are hurting. Sometimes courage means allowing yourself to cry. Sometimes the strongest thing someone can do is simply stand up and speak when their heart is breaking. Paris did that. She did not hide every emotion. She did not pretend everything was fine. She allowed the audience to see how much her father meant to her. That honesty is what made the moment unforgettable. The memory of Daddy. Perhaps the most enduring element of Paris's speech is that she spoke about Michael in the most personal terms. Not as a legend. Not as a superstar. Not as an entertainer. As Daddy. That one word changes the entire perspective. The king of pop could command enormous stadiums. He could perform for tens of thousands. He could influence generations. But in the eyes of his daughter, he was still her father. And when she stood before the world, that was the person she was saying goodbye to. The final thought. Paris Jackson's appearance at Michael Jackson's memorial service remains one of the most emotional moments associated with his death. It was brief. It was unscripted in feeling. And it was deeply personal. An 11-year-old girl stood before an enormous audience and tried to put her love for her father into words. She became emotional. She cried. And the world watched. But perhaps the most respectful way to remember that moment is not to focus only on the tears. Focus on what caused them. Love. A daughter loved her father. And when she lost him, she wanted the world to know how much he meant to her. That is why the moment has endured. Not because Michael Jackson was famous. Not because millions were watching. Not because cameras captured every second. But because for a brief moment, one of the biggest stars in history was no longer the center of the story. His daughter was. And through her voice, the world was reminded of something simple and deeply human. Before Michael Jackson was the king of pop, he was someone's dad. And for Paris, that was the part of him that mattered most. If you remember watching that memorial service, you may remember exactly where you were when Paris stepped toward the microphone. You may remember the silence that seemed to fall over the room. You may remember her voice. You may remember the tears. And you may remember how difficult it was to watch a child say goodbye to her father in front of the entire world. Years later, that moment still carries emotional weight. Because it was never really about celebrity. It was about family. It was about love. And it was about loss. Paris Jackson walked onto that stage as Michael Jackson's daughter. She walked away having given the world one of the most personal glimpses into the man behind the legend. Her speech did not tell us everything about Michael Jackson. It was never supposed to. It told us something about what he meant to one person who knew him in a way that millions of fans never could. To Paris, he was Daddy. And sometimes, that one word says everything. Thanks for the watching and subscribe.